Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We've got a lot to talk about. Hope you had a great weekend, and I might just make a couple of sporting notes real quickly. The Golden State Warriors won again, so congratulations to them. And since so many of you are listening in the Dallas area, we might also send congratulations out to Kenny and Lisa Trout. Their horse Justify won the Triple Crown, and that is quite a feat for any horse, especially that particular one. So I thought I'd mention those real quickly before we get into all sorts of other issues. And, of course, we're going to be talking about this summit, which will be taking place in just a few hours. We have to remember that there's about a 12-hour difference between here and Singapore. So about 9 o'clock tonight is 9 a.m. there when the meeting will be taking place. So we'll talk about that in just a minute, as well as the whole issue of tariffs, because before he headed off to Singapore, Donald Trump was with the individuals there at the special gathering. And that gathering, which is sometimes called the Sevens and the Eights, we'll have to see whether or not the G7 becomes the G8, and that's another whole question in just a minute. We have some issues of tariffs and the response of Justin Trudeau, so we'll get into that. Of course, we have a Supreme Court decision that has just come down, and I want to try to give some perspective to that. I've written a commentary about it before, which allows states to purge the voter rolls for people that haven't voted in a number of elections and have avoided any of the mail asking them if they're still there. So it's a way to clean up the voter rolls, but as you might imagine, there were 4 liberals saying, well, we can't do that, even when we have had someone not vote in 3 consecutive elections and have 3 separate letters that were sent asking, are you still where you are? That's not enough for them to even allow that purge to take place. Of course, suicide's been in the news, and there have been calls for not only increasing federal subsidies and studies of suicide, but also we've seen the suicide hotline calls have jumped by about 25%. And so we'll get into a lot of topics this hour. And if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. If you have some comments about anything from the summit to tariffs, to voting, and even to suicide. And a little bit later, we're going to get into the columns that we have posted today. One having to deal with the fact that everything simple is false, and also the idea that moral standards are on the decline. That all will be something we'll try to cover in the first hour. Second hour today, we have David John Seel with us, the new Copernicans. It's all about the millennial generation and the survival of the church. So we'll get with him a little bit later. Okay, Donald Trump is down there and had a chance to meet with Singapore's Prime Minister today, expressed optimism about the meeting, which is tomorrow, but for us in terms of the time zone difference, it will actually take place tonight because, again, this is a gathering that will take place in really just about 9 hours from now, so that we'll see how it begins to plan out, and so we'll watch that. One of the things that is written by our good friend Jim Dennison is that this meeting will be taking place in a resort island off of Singapore's southern coast, and you have thousands of journalists that have gathered together. You have 2 different agendas between these individuals. Kim, obviously, wants to do what he possibly can to rebuild the North Korean economy. So Kim Jong-un is going to want to focus mostly on what can we do to remove the various sanctions that are preventing us from any kind of economic growth. And, of course, Donald Trump and the Trump administration has made it clear that, yes, we're glad to get rid of those sanctions once we denuclearize the Korean peninsula. And, of course, that's going to be something that probably is going to be the deal breaker, but we'll see how it plays out. And I think it's we need to recognize that this is not the first time there have been attempts at some kind of negotiation between North Korea and the United States. You can go all the way back to 1985. Isn't that amazing? Because that's when you had some talks at that time with North Korea trying to provide some kind of nuclear disarmament. If you are a student of history, you go 1985. Ronald Reagan was the president. And then, of course, all through the 1990s, Bill Clinton was the president. And more recently, of course, you had George W. Bush and you've had Barack Obama. So to assume that Donald Trump is going to bring about a significant breakthrough given this history is maybe asking too much. But, of course, we know there will be a lot of pressure on the president to maybe give up some of the talking points, maybe concede a few points in order to get some movement. But we'll see whether that is indeed the case. We'll see whether or not they reach the common goal of removing nuclear weapons. If they do so, then it's quite possible that North Korea could join the various nations of the world. Even though he's a brutal dictator, maybe there could be even a reunification of North Korea and South Korea. But I don't think any of us should hold our breath on that. And again, as I point out, even if the United States achieves peace with North Korea, we've got a lot of other conflicts that are on the horizon as well. But it would certainly be nice to remove that particular conflict as well. Now, before Donald Trump headed to Singapore, he was with the so-called G7, which he wants to make G8, because after all, they kicked out Russia. He wants to bring them back. And he's been really going back and forth over this issue of tariffs, as well as the responsibility of these other countries to pull their own weight. This I found this morning, which was interesting. Only 4 members of NATO, the North American Treaty Alliance, spent 2% of their GDP on defense in 2007, which is, I think, a reasonable request. You might say, well, what's the United States spend? Well, 3.5%. So that's the first issue, the NATO issue with the G7. But then let's look at the relationship between the United States and Canada and the United States in China. First of all, the United States government has been complaining for years that the Canadian lumber industry has been unfairly subsidized by Canada's national and provincial governments. And, of course, you've had all sorts of companies that have had objection to China stealing intellectual property from companies that do business there. So this is why Donald Trump has said, I'm going to be tough. And apparently he was a little too tough there, because after he left, Justin Trudeau of Canada said all sorts of nasty things about the president. And I think you would know that Donald Trump would just not let that go. So here's the latest that came out here. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada acted so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left saying that U.S. tariffs were kind of insulting. He was not going to be pushed around. Donald Trump said, very dishonest and weak. Our tariffs are in response to his 270% tariff on dairy, which is a pretty high tariff indeed. And, of course, if that's not enough, Donald Trump has a few other people. His trade advisor is a man by the name of Peter Navarro, and he was on Fox News Sunday. If you can believe this one. This is what he said. There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engage in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door. That's what bad faith Justin Trudeau did with his stunt press conference. And I think Trudeau thought he was going to get away with that, and maybe he did with the press in Canada. But as always, our president had something to say about it, and in this case, his trade advisor did as well. We've got a lot more to cover. We will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we all know, Starbucks decided to close down their 8,000 stores for a time of sensitivity training in order to help their employees discover any unconscious racial bias. Some of the employees found it revealing. Others said it made them uncomfortable. Although the leadership of Starbucks thought that it was important to discuss racism, that didn't keep Starbucks from supporting America's most prominent racist group. That would be Planned Parenthood. That is the claim made by Dr. Alveda King and others in an open letter to Starbucks. She questions, as men and women who fight for the value and dignity of every human being, we ask, where is the humanity and inclusion when your company matches employees' donations to Planned Parenthood, whose founder, Margaret Sanger, was an outspoken racist with genocidal intentions? The letter goes on to add, active with the Ku Klux Klan and the eugenics movement, Margaret Sanger's stated agenda was to eradicate the African American population. Her dream is being realized by the slaughter of minority children today through the horror of abortion. Now, in an op-ed in the Washington Examiner, King, the niece of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., lays out some disturbing facts. She says more African Americans have died from abortion than from AIDS, accidents, violent crimes, cancer, and heart disease combined. In America today, a black child is 3 times more likely to be killed in the womb than a white child. And since 1973, abortion has reduced the black population by more than 25%. Later, she adds that about 13% of American women are black, but they have more than 35% of the abortions. We can applaud the decision by Starbucks to take on the problem of racial bias, but we should also question their support of Planned Parenthood. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Also, of course, we broadcast on Facebook Live, and if you want to leave a comment there. And while I'm mentioning Facebook Live, there's something else I didn't mention, and that is we had the Harvest America crusade that took place yesterday, and got a chance to watch that, interestingly enough, online, since we were not at the stadium, and to see how that played out. So just a couple of issues that I thought I'd put on the table there as well. And I want to get to the Supreme Court decision that came down today on this issue of purging voters. But I thought for just a minute, let me take another point or two on this issue of tariffs. First of all, you might want to go to our most recent issue. I guess it's the second most recent issue, I should say, of our Outlook, in which we talk about tariffs in some detail. But I thought to understand maybe the reaction, you might say, my goodness, the president has reacted in such a strong way. His trade advisor, Peter Navarro, I mean, these are really strong comments. And I think you have to understand how long the United States has put up with tariffs that have hurt, they feel, the American economy and the American workers. And the way to maybe illustrate this is to take it out of tariffs for just a minute. I heard a story years ago, and I don't know if it's true or whether it was simply an illustration, but let's assume it was true because it illustrates a point. And that is, this man had been come into some significant money from inheritance or won the lottery or something like that. And so as a gesture of goodwill, he went down the street and opened up everybody's mailbox and put a $100 bill in everybody's mailbox up and down the street. And everybody was thrilled about that. And then, you know, he had such a great experience he decided, well, I'll do it again. And so he put a $100 bill in everybody's mailbox until he came back to the house. And again, got some nice feedback and people waving at him. And so he did it a third time. And then he sort of thought, okay, I'm done. By the end of the week, there were people that were saying, hey, where's my $100 bill? You know, people, making gestures at him. You know what I might mean. And what it was that people went from, oh, my goodness, an unexpected $100 bill in my mailbox to they came to expect a $100 bill in their mailbox. And that, I think, illustrates what has been happening with many of America's trade partners. I'm old enough to remember that how a lot of this happened is what was called the Marshall Plan. You know, after World War II, we had most of these countries were devastated, sometimes because of the bombs that we dropped in Japan and in Germany and wherever. And so oftentimes we would do what we could to get these various nations on their feet. And then over time, sometimes those nations would then take advantage of us with various tariffs. But the justification was, well, after all, they've been trying to get on their feet, or after all, they're our trading partners, and after all, they have to protect themselves. And so you got to a point where our largesse, our graciousness, came to be no longer appreciated. It came to be seen as an entitlement. And Donald Trump looks at this by saying, wait a minute, we've put up with this long enough. Now, there's a really good question to ask, and that is, will these U.S. tariffs hurt Canadian workers worse than Canadian tariffs will hurt U.S. workers? And will some of these U.S. tariffs even hurt American workers in steel or aluminum or those who produce it or whatever? There's all sorts of what-ifs in this regard. And so the big question is this just a means to an end by President Trump, or is it the end? And will the other countries react favorably, or will they just simply have these little press conferences to complain about it, but eventually recognize it's in their best interest no longer to have so many competitive tariffs against us, and if they remove theirs, we'll remove ours. We'll see where this plays out. But I think you have to understand that this is why you have people like President Donald Trump saying, we've allowed you to do this for years. At the very least, you could say thank you. But if you see them somewhat like the people in the neighborhood that got a $100 bill in their mailbox and came from being thrilled that they got a $100 bill in their mailbox to expecting a $100 bill in their mailbox, you can see that maybe that's kind of one of the reasons why you're seeing some of this kind of reaction. I think it would be helpful if the president would tone down his rhetoric. That's not happening. Be nice if his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, would tone down his rhetoric. Maybe that happens. I don't think so. But we'll see how this plays itself out. And sooner or later, somebody's going to have to give in, because these high tariffs are not good for either one of these companies and countries and other industries and transnational companies and corporations and all the rest. It certainly is gumming up the works. So we'll see. And I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a perspective as to why there is such a strong reaction on something like tariffs. But let me get to the Supreme Court decision. I got a lot to cover today, so I really want to keep this moving. And today, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that Ohio did not violate federal laws by purging voters who don't vote and fail to return notices confirming their residency. The majority opinion was written by Samuel Alito, and he noted right off the bat that an estimated 1 in 8 voter registrations in the United States are invalid or inaccurate. Did you hear that again? 1 in 8. Okay, 12, 15%, whatever that percentage could be easily articulated as. That's pretty significant. Now, in the dissent, which came from the 4 liberals, always knew this. I knew this would be 5-4. The only question is whether or not a Kennedy or a Gorsuch or somebody like that might go the other direction. But you knew that the 4 would vote against it no matter what it was, because they would simply not want to do anything, as far as we can see, to clean up the voter rolls. And so Justice Stephen Breyer penned a dissent for the liberal wing And again, they mentioned this is the sixth time that they voted as a block. Oh, wow, what a surprise. Call me surprised about that. And said that most voters simply ignore these warning notices, and so as a result, they get purged. Well, okay, let me ask you this question. If you get a warning notice, maybe it's a warning notice that says, we have a defective part on your car. Do you ignore that? If you do, you deserve the crash that you might end up in. If you get a warning notice from the city or from the homeowners association saying, you need to mow your lawn or you're going to be fined, or you are not allowed to park on the street or you will be fined. You pay attention to that? But here we say, even though we have a situation in which these individuals have not voted in a number of different elections and have received a number of notices, they still should be on the voter rolls. Now, you got to recognize that we've talked on this program before that we have found, this is from September, that there are 248 counties in this country that have more names on the voter rolls than you have total number of people of voting age in those counties at the time of the 2016 election. There's a lot of potential for mischief there, first of all. And in this particular case, the argument was as well, you can't remove somebody if they don't vote. That's true. The 1993 Voter Registration Act, it's oftentimes called the Motor Voter Law, prohibits canceling registration solely on not voting. But that same federal law, which was passed in 1993 under Bill Clinton, also allows names to be removed from the rolls when a voter does not respond to mailings from the state. And so, again, my question for Justice Stephen Breyer, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Elena Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor, the four votes against this, is if missing 3 consecutive election cycles and ignoring various mailings, in many cases 3 or 4 mailings from Ohio, is not sufficient to remove somebody from the voter rolls, what should be the standard? And I think we have a very clear indication that whenever there is something that would be seen as an issue that divides between Republican and Democrat, liberal or conservative, having clean voter rolls and not clean voter rolls, look how all 4 justices voted. And, of course, there's no surprise. The only real question is, what would happen to the other 5? Would one of those individuals say, well, maybe this is just too draconian, maybe this is too much? But, again, my question would be, when we have so many individuals who have moved, they're deceased, or they have duplicate registrations, and we can't remove them even using this process, what process do you propose? I'll read through the dissent when I have some time and see if they have a solution. I'm sure they don't. They just simply want to talk about the fact that everybody has a right to vote. Yes, but it's also a privilege. And if indeed you ignore notice after notice after notice saying if you haven't voted and you aren't even reacting to this notice, we're going to have to remove you from the voter rolls. And all you have to do is say, no, I'm still here. And maybe that's just too much for some people. I don't think so. Be right back.
The young man burst into tears. He was in obvious distress. But thankfully, Don Blythe had the exact answers he needed. God took a chance encounter in a restaurant bathroom of all places and turned it into a divine appointment that forever impacted a young couple and saved the life of their unborn child. Don was able to help because he was prepared. And where does Don Blythe get some of the information and resources he needs to be ready for the next opportunity? He listens to Point of View. He listens because others like you took action. This is your opportunity to help equip people to be ready. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. You can be part of some amazing transformations, and it all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking into pointofview.net. One day, you are going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Want to spend some time talking about suicide for just a minute. You know why. Of course, we've had a number of high-profile suicides. By the way, I might point out there's some others that are in process that might have also become suicides over the weekend. But let's talk about the ones that everybody's familiar with. Kate Spade, first of all, handbag designer. You know David Spade, the comedian? Well, that is his sister-in-law. It's his brother that was married to Kate Spade. And then, of course, you have Anthony Bourdain. And, of course, you had Just, so much happening as a result of that. Lots of letters, comments, felt needs, but more importantly, one of the things we're starting to find out is, especially when chef and food writer Anthony Bourdain died of what was an apparent suicide. Now we know that it was. And in both of these cases, individuals who hung themselves. There were individuals that I want to give credit where credit is due, that as they covered this story, they had a chyron or a place where they put the phone number. And what was the phone number for? It was the phone number for the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And as a result, the number of hotline calls jumped by 25%. So let's give credit to those in the press that saw that sometimes when you have these kinds of high-profile suicides, you can think of Robin Williams and others. We can go through the list. You know it as well as I do. There is sometimes a tendency that people who are maybe already on their edge a little bit say, well, if they kill themselves, maybe it's time for me to end it. Or if they, who seemingly had it all and were so despondent, I don't even know how I'm going to make my next payment on my car. I'm about ready to be evicted. My spouse is going to divorce me. My career is going nowhere, whatever it might be. And so, again, we can see that oftentimes is a situation which you almost sometimes will get these copycat suicides. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But nevertheless, this piece that appeared in the Wall Street Journal by Laura Courts said, whenever a notable person commits suicide, calls to the hotline spike. Just days before Anthony Bourdain's death, the news of another famous person had spread, handbag designer Kate Spade, whose apparent cause of death was also a suicide. Calls jumped 25% in the 2 days after her death compared with the same period the previous week. And so as a result, people often feel connected, she says, to celebrities, whether it be through something like a television program or a product they purchased. When a celebrity dies, this can be a collective sense of loss that many people feel. And the increase in calls that hotlines experience isn't necessarily a direct result of hearing about a celebrity suicide, because individuals are already struggling perhaps with mental health or something else. And so the news of that might be a triggering event. He said, the random number of things that can stimulate people who are already likely to get worse is so varied. When there is a promotion and marketing and in some ways acceptance, it drives people to reach out. So if nothing else, we've seen an increase in the number of phone calls to the various crisis centers that are around the country. And even if you are listening to this right now and saying, well, what is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline? Let me say I will give that number in just a minute, because at least it's one step in that direction. Let me just mention, since so many of you are Christians listening to a Christian radio station, I hope that you would reach out to Christian professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, pastors, and others. But again, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is an 800 number, so just write down 800, and then that number is 273-8255, 273-8255, 1-800-273-8255, and something we will spend some time talking about. Probably will cover this in an entire program. Now, what I would like to do for just a minute, I won't spend much time on it, is to say that there have been all sorts of solutions being suggested, which we again need to have some discernment. On the one hand, certainly, whenever anybody commits suicide, we feel emotionally drawn to try to find an answer, to try to prevent this from happening again. But certain solutions deserve more scrutiny than others, because some of them don't make a great deal of sense. The day after Kate Spade, I'm seeing this article that appeared in a major news magazine saying, well, the way to prevent suicides is to get rid of all the guns. Oh, I guess that shouldn't surprise us, which doesn't work very well, because, after all, Kate Spade hung herself with a scarf, and Anthony Bourdain hung himself with the tie around his robe in a French hotel. Neither of those were actually killing themselves as a result of using a gun. when we've talked about suicide on this program before, I have had friends, sometimes sadly very close friends, that have committed suicide, and I can only think of one time in which that suicide was a result of a gun, and that is where a wife of somebody that actually was on this program with us went and purchased a gun and killed herself in the parking lot. But I can point to all sorts of individuals who are using death by asphyxiation. And I'm not the kind of person to read all of these suicide websites, but individuals that have actually done so have said that this is what shows up time and time again, that the preferred method for suicide is asphyxiation, and that's exactly how these two prominent individuals died. We have some others that once the autopsy comes in, we might have some others, but this is led to another suggestion, and that is by Dr. David Friedman, writing in the New York Times, in which he points out that suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and then laments that last year the National Institutes of Health spent more money researching dietary supplements than it did suicide and suicide prevention. Now, Jim Garrity took this on. I'm glad he did, because you hear these phrases and the implication is, well, if you really are concerned about suicide, you'll spend more money on researching suicide and suicide prevention. I'm all for spending money on research, but as you've heard me say on this program so many times, and I will continue to say this, sometimes we spend millions and millions of dollars to basically prove what common sense and most mothers already knew in the first place. And Jim Garrity points out that, well, let's look at this for just a minute. 68% of Americans take dietary supplements, and that figure is pretty stable. So he says that calculates out to about 220 million people. So he says, I don't mind the NIH doing research into pills that 220 million people are taking. Roughly about 45,000 Americans commit suicide if you assume these numbers. That's and then maybe 10 million Americans have serious thoughts if the studies done by the National Institute of Health are any accurate things. So again, as he says, Friedman means well, and perhaps increased funding in clinical research will indeed lead to reductions in the suicide rate. He's probably correct when he writes, we need to talk more openly about suicide to help people see it as a treatable medical scourge that it is. But at the same time, what he points out is something I wanted to get to, and that is the copycat effect, which is going to be something I'm afraid we're going to see. I hope we don't, and I pray we don't. But this comes from one particular research study, which said there's some convincing evidence for a direct copycat effect. For example, in the book Final Exit, A Guide to Suicide for Terminally Ill Persons, asphyxiation is the recommended means of suicide. You've heard me say that before. There's where it's documented. In the year that Final Exit was published, the number of suicides by asphyxiation in New York City rose 313%, and then goes on to give some of the other numbers. I won't read them all there. Furthermore, a copy of Final Exit was found in the scene of 27% of those suicides. So you can see that whether it's a book, or could we mention 13 Reasons, or a few other things that might actually stimulate that, these are all really grave concerns. So I don't deny that we need to talk openly about suicide. Certainly one of the other things in that article about taking guns away is that we've talked about before how important it would be to actually remove guns from individuals that might have suicidal intentions. And I talk about that not just vicariously, but experientially, both in my extended family and my current family. We've had to remove access to any weapons just simply because that could be a concern as well. But the more important issue is that I don't think getting rid of guns is the solution. If nothing else, we're seeing more and more evidence that because of these books coming out, because of some of these television programs and movies coming out about suicide, if anything, the leading cause of suicides probably will be asphyxiation, and that's what we saw both with Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain. Let's take a break. I've got a couple of articles we've posted here. We have yet to even get to those. We will do that right after these messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act requires a state to provide a compelling justification before it may substantially burden the free exercise of religion. But just what is a substantial burden? In 1963, the Supreme Court said that putting someone to the choice of following the precepts of her religion and forfeiting benefits on the one hand, and abandoning one of the precepts of her religion in order to accept work on the other hand, is a substantial burden. And the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit explained in 1988 that for a city to force a house of worship to move outside city limits and forbid ministry-owned property to be used for religious services substantially burdens religious liberty. The 11th Circuit in 2004 explained that a substantial burden is akin to significant pressure which directly coerces the religious adherent to conform his or her behavior accordingly, and can result from pressure that tends to force adherents to forego religious precepts or from pressure that mandates religious conduct. In 2007, the First Circuit defined substantial burden as one that puts substantial pressure on an adherent to modify his behavior and to violate his beliefs. Our country's long-standing dedication to freedom carefully protects the right of citizens to freely exercise their religion, free from a government-imposed substantial burden. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Learn more and request a free In God We Trust window clean at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org and get your free In God We Trust window clean.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and in the next hour, we're going to have John Seel with us, the new Copernicans and Millennials and the Survival of the Church. One of the articles I've posted here, matter of fact, the first article is by Kevin Williamson. If that name sounds familiar, used to write for the National Review, and then was hired by The Atlantic. Lasted about a week or two, and then he was fired from it because of all the liberals that were upset that a conservative would be writing for The Atlantic. And they found some comment he'd made, well, actually a couple, and he says some things that are much more provocative than anything I'd ever say. But nevertheless, he was fired, and so it's interesting that it now says Kevin Williamson, a Texas-based writer. So I'm sure he's going to do okay financially, but it is kind of sad to see somebody who brings a lot to the table. And his piece is called Can We Talk? And what he's simply doing is helping us understand, at least in the middle of this, I'm not going to read the whole piece, but in the middle of this, recognize something I struggle with whenever we try to do radio. And that is, if you want to make things simple, they're probably going to be false. If you want to make them a little more complex, sometimes they're hard to understand. And so he's talking really about a broader issue, but I'm going to just take the middle part of his column because he's actually responding to a writer for the Los Angeles Times, Nicholas Goldberg. And he points out the fact that what you have are individuals right now that are just simply saying, this is ridiculous. We simply cannot head down this road. Donald Trump is going to bring about a disaster. Donald Trump sees things in a very simple sort of way, and we know that things are a lot more complex. But then they go on to say, and we know that some of the things he believes are wrong because everyone knows, for example, and we're going to get into the examples, that climate change is a problem, immigration is an issue that needs to be dealt with in a more nuanced way, and on and on and on. So anyway, he uses the example of a maxim by Paul Valéry, which basically says everything simple is false, everything complex is unusable. And I don't know how much Kevin Williamson knows about computers, but one of the things I did in graduate school is actually put together computer models. And so he quotes from the world of computer modeling known as Bonini's paradox. That is, the more realistic model is, the more it becomes as complex and difficult to understand as the real world. The simpler and more user-friendly a model becomes, the less accurately it represents the underlying system. And so he recognizes that in some respects, you've got this obvious tension between trying to make something simple enough that people can understand it, and you can even make some policy decisions on the basis of it, but not so simple that it ends up being false. And so now, bringing you back to the comment by Nicholas Goldberg, he writes, obviously, if people can't agree on basic truths, and what are those? Such as whether climate change exists, or whether vaccines are dangerous, or whether immigrants are a net benefit or a net loss to the country, they can't work together for substantive solutions. And what Kevin Williamson says is, well, there's nothing basic about any of the truths related to by this man, Nicholas Goldberg. And he says, let me just look at two of those, climate change and immigration. He says the political dispute surrounding climate change is primarily a scientific question about whether it exists is pure nonsense, cheap but effective rhetoric deploying at left-leaning activists who want to use the well-earned prestige of science as a cudgel. The point he's making is that when people say that people deny climate change, as I've said on the program, everybody believes the climate changes. What they don't necessarily buy into is if indeed the climate is changing for whatever reason, how much is due to human activity, how much is due to the natural variations of climate. They then don't necessarily follow that they accept or reject the policies favored by Al Gore and about the various groups of environmentalists who are unlikely to provide benefits that are worth the cost of imposing them, a view that is, in fact, far more common amongst right-leaning thinkers on the issue than the cartoonish view that Goldberg would prefer us to consider. So the point he's making is when it comes to things like climate change, the real issue is not whether or not the climate changes. Everybody buys that in one way or another. There's an argument about how much of a percentage humans are due to that and how much is. But it is used to say, well, if you accept climate change, then you have to accept these draconian economic models. Not necessarily. The other one, he says, is immigration, something we may get into today in the third hour. Immigration, he says, is not purely an economic question, but the economic questions alone are vastly complex and in all likelihood impossible to model or forecast to any degree of meaningful reliability. He says the usual mechanism by which immigration is said to provide a net economic benefit to the country is poorly understood even by the most of the people who write about immigration on a professional or semi-professional basis. He said, I don't think I've encountered more than 6 people able to explain it. So for people that say it's a benefit, it's a complex economic value, but the part that oftentimes they ignore is the other part of the equation, and that is new immigrant workers put downward pressure on the wages of previous immigrant workers, driving down the prices of some goods and services and thereby raising the price-adjusted terms of the nominally stagnant wages of native-born workers. He wouldn't write about that as though it was a simple question, because it's not. And the point I'm making is that you can read the entire piece, which we've posted, but it's just a reminder again that when you get this hand-waving that takes place in some of these policy debates, everybody believes that climate change is a problem, except these few idiots over here. So everybody has to accept these economic policies and these political policies we're going to implement. No, not necessarily. Everybody believes that immigration is a benefit to society, and these few people that point out that it has an impact on wages, well, again, they're just the outliers First of all, I don't know that that's necessarily the case, but that's the way the rhetoric goes. And then, of course, he has one about vaccines. We won't get into that one as well. But the point is that even the examples used in this Los Angeles Times piece by Nicholas Goldberg, I think, illustrate again how there is such an unwillingness to consider that the other side might have some valid points. And this isn't as clear and as simple as you might believe. And for anybody, as I have done in the past, that has ever tried to put together a computer model or tried to take some really difficult, complex ideas and simplify them, you recognize that life is oftentimes a lot more complex than a lot of these commentators would have us believe. And this, of course, is the constant challenge that we face, even when we're trying to do a radio program and trying to write short 2-minute commentaries, my viewpoint commentaries, to try to educate people about the issues. But nevertheless, wanted you to have a chance to see that. One of the other articles we might get to a little bit later is a piece that looks at how Americans are growing more permissive. And I've posted it on the website saying moral standards on the decline. And so when we look at sexual ethics, we look at drugs, and by the way, when we look at the issue we just talked about, suicide, we see that there is definitely a moral decline in America, and that's very well documented in many of these Gallup polls that have been done, also in some of the Pew Research polls. So you can read that one if you'd like some more facts and figures to make your case. And for those of you that are pastors speaking to the issue of moral decline in America, that particular article is going to give you lots of possible illustrations for your next sermon. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, John Seel is going to be with us. We're going to talk about millennials. We need to do this, perhaps, if this works out, on a Wednesday program, but he has a new book out called The New Copernicans, Millennials and the Survival of the Church. He's saying we need to look at what is changing in our culture with a different framework. So we'll talk about that with him right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. If you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that we really have a desire to reach out to the millennial generation, as illustrated by the fact that every Wednesday we have a millennial roundtable. And no doubt Nick Pitts will be hosting that in 2 days, and I'll be able to sit around the roundtable with him and other millennials talking about this. We've talked with George Barna and Dave Kinnaman and others about some of the surveys. We've had Steve Cable in quite a number of times. The research that he's done through Probe Ministries and Barna Research, the most complete and most significant and comprehensive survey of born-again millennials that's ever been done. So we've looked at some of the facts and the figures, the statistics. We've looked at some of the material from Lifeway and the Pew Research Center and the GSS surveys and Baylor studies and so many different things. But this is a little different. What we're going to try to do now is look at this new book called The New Copernicans, Millennials and the Survival of the Church. And that is that John Seel, who is our guest, in a sense likens millennials to those kind of living in the shadow of Nicholas Copernicus, who was the astronomer who observed that it was the sun rather than the earth that was the center of our solar system. And as a result, we maybe need to have kind of a millennial frame shift. So we're going to try to work our way through this. This maybe will be lighter on some of the facts and data and more on kind of how to think about these issues. And if you're not familiar with John Seel, he's authored quite a number of books. We've talked about him in the past, a cultural analyst and a cultural renewal entrepreneur, individual that actually worked for a while as the director of cultural engagement at the John Templeton Foundation, has his Ph.D. in American Studies from the University of Maryland, and also a Master of Divinity from Covenant Theological Seminary, and joins us now by phone. So, John, Dr. Seel, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, it's a great honor, and it's good to have another opportunity to talk with you.
Well, let's see if we can get into, use kind of two metaphors. We'll take them one at a time. First of all, the new Copernicans. Because in your introduction, you spend some time talking about the fact, as I just mentioned a minute ago, Galileo found himself in a situation in which he was trying to explain that there are two different world systems, a geocentric worldview and a heliocentric worldview. And your argument is, in some respects, is that we sometimes think we're using the wrong frame, the wrong, if you will, in this case, view of the solar system, and so as a result, a lot of facts don't seem to line up. Is that fair?
That is fair. In other words, a lot of the discussions about millennials tends to focus on their age. That is, the shared experiences they had during their maturational years. The sociological term for that is cohort. So the emphasis is on cohort research. And my book actually focuses on the mind shift that they represent, and they're not actually the causes of the mind shift or the frame shift. They are the carriers of it. And so in some ways, it's like they're the first surfer up on the wave. They didn't create the wave, but you can actually tell the speed and direction of the wave by the way they think. And they think very differently in terms of religion, in terms of reality, in terms of relationships. Now, my argument is not only do they think differently, but they think better. And if we would pay attention to them, we would end up becoming more like Jesus. Now, let me make a slight caveat and change metaphors. What I'm arguing is that not all millennials, or in this case, new Copernicans, have the right software, but most of them are operating from the right or from an improved operating system.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what I'm arguing.
That's a good one. Now, there's one other metaphor, since we're using metaphors here, and that is you talk about the Titanic. You know, the Titanic had different warnings, and what I get from you is that there are real significant warnings, Mayday, 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 but you can go all the way back to some warnings like the pon-pon, which aren't as significant. And sometimes as I go through the book, I'm not sensing that you're going, Mayday, Mayday, you're going pon-pon. This is something to pay attention to. We don't have an imminent collision with an iceberg. We don't have two ships crashing into each other. But if we don't pay attention to this pretty soon, we're going to see some of those collisions either inside the church or outside the church. True?
Yes, I think the survival of the church is, and I would also think secular business thinks that the survival of almost every brand is dependent on paying attention to this generation. And we are losing this generation in droves. The recent report that came out suggests that 1 million kids per year that are currently in the church will lose all connection to the church, and that trend will continue for the next 30 years, so that by 2050, there'll be 35 million people who were once in the church but are now outside the church. And I think this is the missional front line, the greatest opportunity for the church, and it's going to take us both caring about, understanding, and listening to this generation in new ways.
Okay, well, let's talk about this idea of a frame shift. This is the part where I want to make sure everybody's paying attention for a minute, because it takes a little bit of thought. But you're suggesting that we sort of have this left brain thinking. We've sort of done everything from kind of a logical, linear point of view. Now, we've inherited that from the Enlightenment and maybe even before that. And you're suggesting, and this is probably not a new idea, that they tend, that is the millennial generation, tend to view the word a little bit differently. When we hear people saying, you don't always want to make an argument, sometimes you want to tell a story, it seems to me that that might be part of this. But explain how, in some respects, we've got to maybe change the way we look at the problem. Can you help us with that?
Sure. In other words, everyone thinks first in pictures or through a frame, a set of assumptions about the nature of the good life, and what it's about. Now, if you're kind of academically oriented, you can kind of go off and talk about worldviews. But most people don't use worldviews unless isms is a normal part of your daily conversation. But most people have the stories they tell, the kind of things they get from television and advertising, the stories they tell that frame their social imagination about the nature of the good life. And what we're arguing here is that for about 300 years, we have bought into a kind of left brain way of thinking that starts first with reason, and maybe very quick to say, I have nothing against reason. The problem is that if you start with reason, reason tends to take over and tends to make it so that it's impossible to use your right brain. You should start first with the right brain, that is, it sees things as a whole, and then break it down. Or put it this way, simply, we've often been taught to do Bible study through observation, interpretation, and application. Or maybe we could think of it as head, heart, hand. Well, what the millennials are saying, and what neuroscience is also telling us, that the best way to learn is through experience first, then through an engagement of your imagination, which is then subsequently analyzed. Or put it simply, the best way to learn is hand, heart, head.
Just the opposite.
And it's just the opposite. And this generation is calling this to our attention.
We'll take a break, continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we all know, Starbucks decided to close down their 8,000 stores for a time of sensitivity training in order to help their employees discover any unconscious racial bias. Some of the employees found it revealing. Others said it made them uncomfortable. Although the leadership of Starbucks thought that it was important to discuss racism, that didn't keep Starbucks from supporting America's most prominent racist group. That would be Planned Parenthood. That is the claim made by Dr. Alveda King and others in an open letter to Starbucks. She questions, as men and women who fight for the value and dignity of every human being, we ask, where is the humanity and inclusion when your company matches employees' donations to Planned Parenthood, whose founder, Margaret Sanger, was an outspoken racist with genocidal intentions? The letter goes on to add, active with the Ku Klux Klan and the eugenics movement, Margaret Sanger's stated agenda was to eradicate the African American population. Her dream is being realized by the slaughter of minority children today through the horror of abortion. Now, in an op-ed in the Washington Examiner, King, the niece of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., lays out some disturbing facts. She says more African Americans have died from abortion than from AIDS, accidents, violent crimes, cancer, and heart disease combined. In America today, a black child is 3 times more likely to be killed in the womb than a white child. And since 1973, abortion has reduced the black population by more than 25%. Later, she adds that about 13% of American women are black, but they have more than 35% of the abortions. We can applaud the decision by Starbucks to take on the problem of racial bias, but we should also question their support of Planned Parenthood. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. John Seel with us today as we talk about his new book. It's published by Thomas Nelson. We have information about him and about the book on our website, The New Copernicans, Millennials and the Survival of the Church. It is a book that I'm sure you would want to get a copy of, 250 pages in round numbers. And if you can't find it in your local bookstore, there's a place for you to order it as well. Well, John, you were talking about the fact that oftentimes we use head, heart, hands. And in some respects, you're saying that for this generation, it's a different operating system, if we want to use that metaphor, and it's more hands, head, heart, head. It's just the reverse of that. And you use an example that I thought was helpful. It's with Tim Keller. Since we had Tim Keller on here, I don't think he'd mind us critiquing him. But he's asked by someone in the New York Times, in order to be a Christian, I have to believe in the virgin birth, I have to believe, those kinds of things. And he starts down the logic train. What you were suggesting is how he could have started with the experiential train. Help us out. If you found yourself being asked that same question by an editor or a columnist with the New York Times, how would you have responded to that? Or how, in order to engage not only the millennial generation but others, what's the different way in which you might respond to that?
Well, first of all, it's very important to think about the frame in which they're operating. And in the case of the interview that Tim had, and Tim is a friend, actually, and I reluctantly included that illustration.
We count him as a friend, so that's why we can use that. And besides, you could use me as an example if you want. It doesn't matter. But I think we can learn some things.
The point is that he was starting from a closed like a new atheist perspective.
Right.
He was a closed naturalist perspective. And so to start piling on facts when he's operating in the wrong frame, in other words, minimally, he's got to be open to the possibility of some kind of transcendence. He's not. So if you start piling on facts to the wrong frame, the facts bounce off and the frame stays. So then the question is, facts work very well within a frame, or to use scientific language, they work well within a paradigm. But if you're in a situation where you're having to do a paradigm shift, that is, you're talking between two competing frames, which is often the case of ministry today and apologetics today, then simply piling on more facts is going to be counterproductive. And at best, you come out where Tim did, which was an impasse. So what you have to do is find a way to reframe the conversation, and that's usually done through stories, experience, or some engagement of the imagination. In other words, and our proclivity within the church is to pour on the facts, and sometimes we need to step back and say, well, we actually need to be operating within a completely different frame. And my first task from an apologist standpoint is to open them up to a new frame. So for C.S. Lewis, when he was an atheist in high school, etc., it was Owen Barfield that moved him from being an atheist to being an open mystic. Now, he did not move from being an atheist to a Christian. He moved from an atheist to being a pantheist, or actually he even dabbled in the occult. And then it was later that Tolkien and Dyson were able to move him from his mysticism and his interest in myths to say, well, actually there's myths that happen to be true, and moved him to the gospel. So the fact is that we're in a situation today in a post-Enlightenment, post-secular, post-Christian context. We have to pay attention to the frames that people have. And give you a political illustration, the EU controversy, which was framed in England as Brexit.
Right.
Everybody talked about that controversy in terms of that one word, Brexit. And then you have to ask, so that word, which was used to frame the entire conversation, is it suggesting that we stay in the EU or leave it? By definition, it is, by using exit in the word, it establishes the frame, and in fact, that's the direction it went. So frames really matter. Frames rule because they're the first move. And so I'm calling us attention to the fact that this generation has a different frame. It's often a better one. It's a better operating system, even if they're not Christians, because to use kind of theological language, they tend to be more incarnational, more Trinitarian, more communal, more relational, more aspirational, and more revolutionary. And then I ask people, now, who does that kind of sound like? Well, it kind of sounds like Jesus. Now, in terms of incarnational, it means that they really operate first from experience. Trinitarian means that they embrace mystery, ambiguity, and complexity. Communal means that they bias relationships and put a big emphasis on shared communal experience. Aspirational meaning they really do want to make the world a better place. And so for many, the low-hanging fruit as an on-ramp to spiritual thinking for them is through social justice and trying to make the world a better place.
What I think is so interesting is you point out in the book that the new atheist, whether it's the Richard Dawkins or when he was alive, Christopher Hitchens or all the other individuals, they sort of figured this out before the church has. No surprise there. Church is sometimes a day late and a dollar short. But it's interesting that even though they live in kind of a closed, immanent system that you talk about, they are recognizing that they have to maybe frame their appeal for atheism or agnosticism in a different sort of way than, say, even the way the church does. And that's pretty striking, I would think.
Well, yes, I actually think that the big popularity and explosion that happened around New Atheists, whenever you see a big glow on the horizon, it's probably prudent to ask, is that a sunset or a sunrise? And I'm arguing in the book that it's a sunset. It's the last gasp of a failed approach. And unfortunately, the church is spending an inordinate amount of time in seminaries preparing people to deal with New Atheism, which I'm arguing is pretty passé. What we should be dealing with is neo-pagans.
Right.
Now that's a lot trickier, messy, doesn't feel quite as comfortable. We like our atheists to be, we like our pagans to be kind of erudite academic philosophers or biochemists or biologists. And actually, most of them that we're going to run into are going to be dabbling in the cult and witches and at Burning Man and at Comic-Con and in the whole set of conversations that, generally speaking, we feel really uncomfortable in, and yet that's actually the front line today.
Yes. And when you say neo-pagans, that might explain why so often, even when we have people call into this program, but certainly when we're out in the world and we'll talk to individuals, and you go out doing church visitation, or you're at a Starbucks and somebody says, you know, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Doesn't that kind of give a sense of where the kind of the neo-pagan area is headed? You know, I'm spiritual, but I'm not really religious, right?
That is, they're anti-church, been there, done that, but they're open to the possibility of something more. In fact, they have a fear of missing out. They're haunted about the possibility of a larger universe of God. As one author, a British author, wrote in the very first sentence in his book was, "I do not believe in God, and I really miss him."
Yes, you use that in the book. And you say, for those of us with a left brain, that doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Right. And it's that tension that is very much a part of this new way of thinking.
Yes.
And I think it creates, actually the neo-pagans are closer to the gospel than the old atheists, than the new atheists.
Well, let's take a break, and we'll come back, and I want to get into that in a little more detail, because you really have whole sections here on how to embrace some of that, what the survival strategies might be, and a number of other things. But we have one of those mandatory breaks. By the way, if you'd like to join us, I think this may be one where you just want to sit back and listen. But again, David John Seel, Jr. is the name on the book, and it is The New Copernicans, Millennials and the Survival of the Church. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about him, I'd like to know a little bit more about his book, we have a link to his website, which gets you into NC Conversations, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And we also have information about the book, which, of course, you can find in your local bookstore, but it's also available in paperback and Kindle online. Let's take a break. We'll get into the conversation a little bit further right after this.
The young man burst into tears. He was in obvious distress, but thankfully, Don Blight had the exact answers he needed. God took a chance encounter in a restaurant bathroom of all places and turned it into a divine appointment that forever impacted a young couple and saved the life of their unborn child. Don was able to help because he was prepared. And where does Don Blythe get some of the information and resources he needs to be ready for the next opportunity? He listens to Point of View. He listens because others like you took action. This is your opportunity to help equip people to be ready. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. You can be part of some amazing transformations, and it all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking into pointofview.net. One day, you are going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
How can we reach out to the millennial generation, and in particular, what can the church do to maybe change some of its frame shift in a way to understand what's taking place here and to be more effective in communicating the gospel? So those are some topics we are addressing today in the new book, The New Copernicans, Millennials and the Survival of the Church. But let me also, for just a minute, John, go to your website, which is the New Copernican Conversations, which is ncconversations.com. People don't have to write it all out because we have a link to the website there as well. And there are some resources that are available, including, of course, this book, endorsements, other resources, a way that people can contact you. But talk about some of the resources that are available.
Well, I regularly write a blog that tries to demonstrate how one can communicate effectively within this world. I would say that most of my audience are spiritually frustrated and homeless. So they're not really the hybrid New Copernicans that are still in the church. Most of them have abandoned the church, don't think the church has a lot to say to them. And so for me is to find effective ways to communicate things that would engage them in their own spiritual pilgrimage and draw them closer to Jesus Christ.
And one of the things I appreciate about your piece. Yeah, go ahead. For example,
one of my blogs in there is, are you ready to hug a witch? And it's about a transgender witch in Brooklyn. There was an article in the New York Times on the season of witches and the rise of witches. This particular person, there are some witches that are basically like Wiccans that are basically worship nature. This witch is, we might call her, a biblical witch because she actually believes in the occult. She believes in hexes. She's really the old school kind of witch. And of course, it's not surprising she grew up in a Christian home.
Yeah.
And so the question I have is, I really love people like this. This is really the people for whom my heart breaks. And what would I say if I had a chance to have a cup of coffee with her that would be helpful? Because she's really, really angry at the church, really, really angry at every Christian she's ever met. And the question is, if this is the rising generation, people who are operating within this frame, we've got to find a whole new way of presenting ourselves in the gospel for truth's sake. And one of the ways, of course, is that we have to change our attitude. We can't immediately assume that we have we have a corner on the truth. So somehow we have to affirm the fact that reality is more complicated than I will ever know, and that I could be wrong on some important things that I'm saying. And that's actually true of things I said in this book, and that there's probably a lot I could learn from you. And that's why we enter into a conversation with that kind of attitude. It creates the opportunity of real dialogue. Most of our relationships with non-believers have an instrumental feel to them, and millennials are really sensitive to being hustled, and so they'll be really turned off. I argue in the book that we don't need actually friendship evangelism. What we need is friendship. What we really need is to know how to hang out with people and love them right where they are, and to walk aside them in their own spiritual pilgrimage and ask a pointed question that moves them closer to Jesus, just like Dyson and Tolkien did with Lewis on the Addison Way at Oxford.
One of the things that you talk about in your section on responses to the warning, you have a chapter there on self-righteous blindness and a chapter 13 on humility in theology. And I get the sense that that's what you're saying in terms of the conversation. Sometimes we come as if we're just as can I use the word, almost arrogant or confident as the Richard Dawkins of the world, and that we got all our theology down. And if you just sit here and listen for a minute, I'll just give you a data dump of what the Bible says, and then you'll be better. Mm-hmm. And that's not exactly the best way to build a relationship, is it?
No, it'll prove to be counterproductive. And it's also being proved to be counterproductive to the atheists too. I was in a meeting in New York where I was presenting the content of this book to a group of leadership in New York of Black Lives Matter. And at this particular meeting, there was some the editors of the communist newspaper in New York. And now actually they're Maoists. So, but they were espousing a kind of doctrinaire Marxism right out of the Capitol, the likes of which I had not heard since graduate school. And the New Copernican artists, activists who were in the room literally were rolling their eyes. And so these older women finally said, communist women said to them, do you believe in God? And they said, oh, yes, which is exactly what I said. And so they thought that was going to be like the high trump card. And they said, well, we do not. We're atheists. And the end of the day, they said, well, we actually believe that we can do social justice without violence, and we operate in a completely different way. Now, what was happening there, it was just like I was hearing some kind of fundamentalist talking to this kind of New Copernican, except these were atheists. So the Dawkins and the fundamentalists are operating with the same kind of epistemological, cognitive, confident frame, and literally they were talking right past each other. There's a phrase, I grew up as a missionary kid in South Korea, and there's a phrase in Korea, East question, West answer. And that is literally what I was watching in front of me. I didn't have to say a thing. But the way they were framing their debate for Marxism was obviously hard-edged, doctrinaire, overly confident, quite self-assured. And the thing that New Copernicans understand, they understand that all belief, that faith and doubt are both sides of belief.
Right.
And in their minds, they're fused together, and they live with the tension of that kind of reality. And I just think that's actually, more biblical, it's more human, and it's truer to the gospel. And except the problem is that too many in the church don't live or talk that way. And that's to our shame. And we have a new opportunity to listen to this crowd. I think that if we were to listen, we could learn some important lessons. I'm not a hand-wringer over millennials. In other words, I'm not a hand-wringer over religious nuns. I think that, in fact, they are a gift to the church because they are a prophetic voice calling attention to our own accommodation to culture and calling us back to something that is more ancient, more true, more biblical, and will equip us more effectively for ministry in a post-Christian world.
Very good. You mentioned doubters, your chapter on haunted doubters. You use the example, this will rattle everybody's cage, and that is if you want to get the ideal type of New Copernicans, you have to look at the Burning Man Festival in Black Rock City, Nevada. And then you go through some of the various things that are part of their structure, kind of their 10 points. But these 10 principles, in some respects, kind of correlate very well with where the evangelical mindset is, doesn't it?
Well, yes, they want participation. They want very sensitive to ecology and leave no trace. So I think that we would be very well suited. Now, people get really turned off about Burning Man because it is the quintessential cultural zeitgeist event for what I'm talking about in terms of this book, The New Copernicans. I would say probably Comic-Con is second, and then there are other music festivals. But now, Burning Man is extremely pagan. It's also extremely religious. And so we've got to find a way of being able to engage that larger conversation. I've had the opportunity to talk to an Episcopal bishop who is the dean of the cathedral in Sacramento, who regularly attends Burning Man, and he's there blessing people and praying with people. And they have a temple. They erect a temple for worship. Now, it's pagan, but the point of it is that we need to be able to start where people are and move them to Jesus.
We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act requires a state to provide a compelling justification before it may substantially burden the free exercise of religion. But just what is a substantial burden? In 1963, the Supreme Court said that putting someone to the choice of following the precepts of her religion and forfeiting benefits on the one hand, and abandoning one of the precepts of her religion in order to accept work on the other hand, is a substantial burden. And the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit explained in 1988 that for a city to force a house of worship to move outside city limits and forbid ministry-owned property to be used for religious services substantially burdens religious liberty. The 11th Circuit in 2004 explained that a substantial burden is akin to significant pressure which directly coerces the religious adherent to conform his or her behavior accordingly, and can result from pressure that tends to force adherents to forego religious precepts or from pressure that mandates religious conduct. In 2007, the First Circuit defined substantial burden as one that puts substantial pressure on an adherent to modify his behavior and to violate his beliefs. Our country's long-standing dedication to freedom carefully protects the right of citizens to freely exercise their religion, free from a government-imposed substantial burden. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Learn more and request a free In God We Trust window cling at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org and get your free In God We Trust window cling.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John Seel with us for a little bit longer as we talk about the book, The New Copernicans. And John, it just occurs to me that maybe one way to put some of this in a sort of a biblical context is to look at the book of Acts, because you can see that when Paul goes, say, in Acts 13 to the synagogue, he's using kind of a left-brain rational explanation because he's dealing with individuals that believe in a coming Messiah. They have read the Old Testament. They're probably using a great deal of logic and those kinds of things. But by the time he gets to Acts 17, he's at Mars Hill. There is a pantheon of gods. It's more kind of the world that we find ourselves today. And so he sort of has to back up. In a sense, what you're saying is the millennials are living in a world that's a lot more like Acts 17 than in a world like Acts 13.
That's exactly right. And so he says, now you're worshiping this unknown God. Let me explain that to you. And so what we need to do is start with the aspirations that they have and start from there and move them to Jesus Christ. So many people quote Chesterton. It actually wasn't Chesterton who first said it, but he said, you know, a person who's knocking at the door of a brothel, he's actually looking for God. Well, most people in the church don't know how to process that statement. And they don't know how to move that conversation from your desire for love and sex and lust, etc., the brothel, to what God intended in terms of marriage and in terms of sexuality and embodied existence. We have a great difficulty moving our conversations, and this is where there's huge opportunities in the church and in seminaries to actually equip people to be more effective, as Paul was effective when he preached on Mars Hill. We're living in the Mars Hill, actually more extreme than even Mars Hill probably today.
Yes. You know, probably in the hinterland. You know, one of the other aspects we talk about with millennials is the importance of relationships. Chapter 18 talks about that. Chapter 19, authenticity. It does seem to me right now, this is a generation that is seeking relationships. It also is the most media-wise generation, so it's very aware that when you're trying to sell them something or when you're trying to con them. So relationships and authenticity, very high values if we're going to be effective to reach out to this generation, don't you think?
Yeah, you've got to be as real can be. Now, authenticity is not something you can call yourself. It's something someone else can say about you. But that would be the case when you have the kind of authentic love that is non-judgmental and accepts them right where they are. It's a kind of response that people often get to Pope Francis. There's something authentic about the nature of his spirituality. I find that many of the people who I find embody the goals that we really need to express in the church, people like Dallas Willard, C.S. Lewis, Brendan Manning, Krista Tippett on NPR. These are people who are winsome, inclusive, have an overwhelming sense of the presence of Christ within their life, and it emanates from them in ways that is fundamentally compelling, and it draws people in. And it's more about the quality of their lives than it is about the words that they say.
Let's, if we can, talk about how people can connect up with you. I think there's some people that are listening saying, okay, I think I get this, but I probably need to get into some of the resources that you have because, of course, people can find the book and some of the resources. There's a video or two that they can watch. There are just a variety of resources. So talk about what would be available if you're a church leader. Maybe you're a pastor, a Sunday school leader, Bible fellowship leader, small group leader. That says, okay, what we're doing right now is not reaching millennials, so I'm willing to come up with a paradigm shift, but what does that kind of look like? How do they connect up with you?
Well, obviously, if you're playing tennis and you're losing one way, it's better to try losing a different way. And what we're doing now clearly is not working, so we might as well creatively explore the possibilities of being more effective for the sake of Christ. Well, I would be happy to give out my cell phone number or my, but probably the safest thing to do would be to say that on my blog, New Copernicans, ncconversations.com, on my blog, if you subscribe to the blog, you can message me and send me messages, and I will instantly respond back to you. I've had some wonderful conversations with believers in Alaska, and they reached out to me through my blog, through messaging on my blog. And so that's really on the internet, easily done. You just sign up for the blog and then send me a message, and I will contact you right away.
Let me also mention that under your resource section, you have some videos, and we always really like to promote those, John, because, for example, the one on New Copernicans, it's just a little about 3 minutes long. So I would encourage people to go to ncconversations.com. Again, they don't have to write it all out. Just go to our website, pointofview.net, follow the links, go to resources, and it's about 3 minutes. You could watch it. Then I would encourage you maybe to click the share button, put it on a Facebook page or a Twitter feed, or send it to your pastor and get some conversations. One on experiences. There's a whole bunch of other resources. But
the third one on spheres, spherical thinking, is really important because what New Copernicans don't like to be put in boxes. So they operate in the cloud. And so they have a completely different way of processing politics, religion, ideologies. So that one is particularly good. All those videos were done by filmmakers at the Sundance Film Festival. And actually, all of them were done before I wrote my book. And I would say I learned by listening to them, largely. This is a book for pastors who are trying to figure out how their church can survive and reach millennials. It's for parents who are fearful that their faith is not being passed on to the next generation. And most specifically, it's for the perplexed who are wondering, is there something I'm missing out on? Because I have actually never heard faith talked about in this kind of way. And the biggest encouragements to me have been the fact of people who've been struggling with their faith, who have found this book really helpful in getting them onto a solid pilgrimage toward Jesus.
Well, again, appreciate you joining us here on Point of View. The book, again, is called The New Copernicans, Millennials and the Survival of the Church. We have a link to John Seel as well as to the book, and it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. So thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much, Kerby, and for the important work you do.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the subject of immigration. Our plan was originally to talk to Jenny Yang. She is in labor right now, so we are going to go to Matthew Sorens, which actually works out because he was on with us last July when we talked about the book Welcoming the Stranger, and we're going to talk about the immigration debate. And again, this book has been out since 2009, but there's a new version coming out this year. Matter of fact, it's coming out next month, and so we're going to work our way from the older book to the newer book and give you a chance to ask some questions about immigration. There are all sorts of issues in the news right now that we need to address, and that's one of the reasons why we'll spend some time talking about that in the second hour. If you'd like to know a little bit more about John Seel, it says on the cover, David John Seel. He goes by his middle name, as many of us do, and it is the New Copernicans, and it's another attempt to help us understand what is happening as we try to reach out to the millennial generation. So we will have those conversations, probably come back to it again on Wednesday when we have our Millennial Roundtable. But let's take a break. When we come back, Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. Have a lot to talk about in terms of immigration. We will do that right after these important messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to focus our time and attention on the subject of immigration. Lots of reasons for that. First of all, this last month we had U.S. border agents made more than 50,000 arrests, and this is now the third month in a row in which you have had at least 50,000 people arrested at our southern border. That, if you totaled up, is 150,000 individuals. We have, of course, a vote taking place in Congress very soon on DACA, and we'll get into the whole DACA issue perhaps a little bit later. We've also posted a piece that comes from a couple of individuals that have been on this program with us before: Samuel Rodriguez, president of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, and James Robison, who's an evangelist and founder of Life Outreach. Piece that appeared in the Stream called Solving the Immigration Problem. And we also want to focus some time and attention on this book, Welcoming the Stranger. It's a book that came out in 2009, but a new edition is coming out next month. And our original goal was to talk with one of the co-authors, Jenny Yang, but turns out that she's in labor right now. So the other co-author is an individual we've had on before, Matthew Sorens. He's actually been with us back in July of last year, and is the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization at World Relief, and is an individual that has really been working in this area, has served as the field director for Evangelical Immigration Table, which is a coalition of Christian organizations that is working in that area, has a bachelor's degree from Wheaton College, a master's degree from DePaul. And Matthew, thank you for stepping in at the last moment. Jenny, I guess, is in labor right now, from what I understand.
Yeah, no news to report so far, but I'm happy to be flexible, and I appreciate you having me back, Kerby.
Yes. I was tempted to say, that's a lame excuse, but we all know that's not. And so, again, it's great to have you here. Let's talk about the updated book, because last time we were with you, we talked about this book. I've got the 2009 edition, and a lot has happened in 9 years. So give us an update on the new edition, what you've had a chance to add to it since the last time you and I've talked.
Yeah, you know, it has been, there's been a lot that's changed in the nearly decade since we wrote the first edition of the book, and both in terms of immigration policy and in terms of how the church is responding to immigration issues. So I think the latter is where I'm really encouraged, because we've seen so many church leaders step forward at the denominational level, at the local church level, in the past several years, and say this is an important issue that is a biblical issue first and foremost, and something that we want to respond to as a biblical issue before we get into any of that politics. So it was really encouraging to be able to write about how immigrants are in many ways transforming the church in the United States, and give more examples of that than we could have 10 years ago. And then the flip side, of course, is immigration policy. It was controversial 10 years ago, but I think it's arguably more controversial now, and it seems like you can't go a day without it being a headline issue. And it can be very divisive even within the church. So one of the things we really want to do with the book is to provide biblical light into some of the heat that is generated by all the political debates.
And again, you've got some chapters where you deal with some of the misinformation. So let's see if we can get some basic facts here. We usually say that we have about 1 million people that immigrate legally here. But how many people are here illegally? I hear different numbers being used. At World Relief, have you gotten any sense of how many people are in the shadows who are here illegally and what that number might be?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't been able to independently verify that, but the Pew Research Center does an annual, estimate of that, so does the Migration Policy Institute. And it's been a few years, but the Department of Homeland Security has done estimates on that at a governmental level as well. And they all think the number is somewhere around 11 million people, give or take a few 100,000. And that number is actually down a little bit over the past 10 years. We've seen fewer people, significantly fewer people trying to enter the country unlawfully. And we're now at the point where if you look at immigrants who are undocumented, who are not here lawfully, who've come in the last several years, they're significantly more likely to have come in on a valid visa and overstayed, as opposed to entering across the border unlawfully, which used to be the more common mode of entry for people who find themselves here unlawfully.
And that's one of the things I've said before, that the numbers I've heard, the percentages that maybe 40% of the people that are here illegally come from overstaying their visas, and then others come from crossing a border, getting off ships, whatever it might be. So when we talk about solutions, certainly securing the border, but E-Verify, all sorts of other issues. But I know we're going to focus most of our time and attention here on the church, but again, that's something else that we can talk about in terms of the particular need. If we're talking about people either that came here legally or illegally, it seems to me that one of the first things the church can provide is English as a second language, maybe helping with job skills, those kinds of things. So take us through what are some of the options, since we have pastors and church leaders and Sunday school leaders and small group leaders listening to this program right now.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the government's response to this is important. It affects people in God's image. But I want to make sure that we don't only focus on the government's response and miss the church's response, which I think is actually the more clear thing in Scripture. So there's very practical ways for local churches to serve the immigrants in their community. And one important thing to know is it's not illegal under U.S. law to teach someone English, regardless of if you think you know their legal status or not, or to have them be a part of a Sunday school class, or to be baptized, or any of the sort of normal ministry things that a church would do. So English, as you mentioned, is a huge need. I know a lot of immigrants. I go to an immigrant church, and I would say I don't think I've ever met someone who didn't want to learn English. I've met some who tried harder than others, and some of that is it's a lot easier to learn English if you come as a 5-year-old than if you come as a 75-year-old. And, of course, people have busy schedules, but people really do want to learn the language, and the more options there are for that, and churches can be such an integral part, and have been historically, of helping immigrants to learn the language. And in the process to build relationships as well. Some of the immigrants who come to our country are already believers, but others are not yet believers. They don't have a relationship with Jesus. And there's a great opportunity for the gospel there as well. I would also mention youth programs are really important. Immigrant families tend to be really focused on education, but if the parents don't speak English well, they probably can't help their kids really with their homework.
Yeah.
So having a native English speaker who can help, tutor kids, that sort of thing, is a really important thing. And then one last thing I would mention is legal services, which is not something you can do if you don't have the appropriate training, but it is possible for a church or another nonprofit to get recognized by the U.S. Department of Justice to provide immigration legal services, even if they don't have an attorney on staff. It's a special program that World Relief has been able to be part of for many years, and we've been able to help a lot of local churches, several dozen local churches around the country, to go through that training. Because, again, most immigrants who are not here lawfully, and it's important to note that most of the immigrants in the country are here lawfully, but among those who aren't, most of them are desperate to get right with the law. And very often that's not possible without changes to law, but occasionally it is, and helping people sort through where they fit into the immigration legal system is really important. And it's a way for the church to help people at a very vulnerable point.
Might just mention that at least the copy of the book I have, and I assume it'll be in the one that is coming out next month, there's a whole section on discussion questions, some key kind of phone numbers and other issues, because if your church decides at all to reach out, you're going to want some of those resources, and that's why I wanted to mention the book, Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. Came out in 2009. A new one is coming out next month in July, and we're talking with Messel Sorens. And if you have some comments or questions about immigration, maybe you're dealing with that in your own church, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
As we all know, Starbucks decided to close down their 8,000 stores for a time of sensitivity training in order to help their employees discover any unconscious racial bias. Some of the employees found it revealing. Others said it made them uncomfortable. Although the leadership of Starbucks thought that it was important to discuss racism, that didn't keep Starbucks from supporting America's most prominent racist group. That would be Planned Parenthood. That is the claim made by Dr. Alveda King and others in an open letter to Starbucks. She questions, as men and women who fight for the value and dignity of every human being, we ask, where is the humanity and inclusion when your company matches employees' donations to Planned Parenthood, whose founder, Margaret Sanger, was an outspoken racist with genocidal intentions? The letter goes on to add, active with the Ku Klux Klan and the eugenics movement, Margaret Sanger's stated agenda was to eradicate the African-American population. Her dream is being realized by the slaughter of minority children today through the horror of abortion. Now, in an op-ed in the Washington Examiner, King, the niece of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., lays out some disturbing facts. She says more African Americans have died from abortion than from AIDS, accidents, violent crimes, cancer, and heart disease combined. In America today, a black child is 3 times more likely to be killed in the womb than a white child. And since 1973, abortion has reduced the black population by more than 25%. Later, she adds that about 13% of American women are black, but they have more than 35% of the abortions. We can applaud the decision by Starbucks to take on the problem of racial bias, but we should also question their support of Planned Parenthood. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Matthew Soren's with us today. He co-authored this book with Jenny Yang. And again, as I mentioned, she was going to be with us, but is in labor, and we'll find out a little bit more about that, maybe get her on in the future. The book is entitled Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. Of course, I have a copy of the book that came out many years ago. It's got a 2009 copyright, but a new book coming out next month, and it is updated and will be helpful to those of you that want to have a ministry to the immigrants in your community. And Matthew, let's talk about that for just a minute in terms of the worldview. If you have somebody coming over here and they maybe been seeking asylum because they were a Christian who was persecuted, or of course, I am aware of a number of people that have immigrated here legally from South Korea, and they have a Korean church in our church, and some that have come from Cuba and other Latin American countries. They have a Spanish-speaking church. So those are obviously almost instantaneous opportunities. Matter of fact, I'm familiar just down the road here. They have a Nepal church that everybody in that particular gathering is from Nepal, which is amazing because sometimes that can happen in a place like where you live in Chicago or Dallas. But what about the others? Can you give us a sense of what maybe the religious background is of some of the other immigrants that have come to America? Because that becomes sort of a mission field and even kind of a worldview training venue, don't you think?
Yeah, sure. And so it depends a little bit what category of immigrant you're looking at. If you look at immigrants overall, a significant majority identify with some sort of a Christian tradition. So it's split between the Catholics and Latin American immigrants tend to be more Catholic than Protestant, although there's a growing trend of Protestant churches in Latin America. If you look at specific groups of immigrants, like, for example, refugees, it is true that the plurality of those who've come as refugees, so people identified abroad as having fled persecution, the plurality of them actually are Christians. Many of them are people who were persecuted, particularly because of their Christian faith. But there are many coming from other religious backgrounds as well. About 40% in recent years have been Muslim from a variety of countries, many from Iraq and Afghanistan, who actually served alongside U.S. troops, and that's what's made them vulnerable to persecution. But from Syria, from Somalia. And our view at World Relief has always been that, there's actually an incredible opportunity for the church as we love our neighbors, which we're called to do regardless of their background, as we care for people. It's actually rare that sooner or later they don't ask that question of, why is this team from our church welcoming us? Why have they been so kind to us, even as people from a different religious background? And we get to, as First Peter says, to be ready to give an answer for the reason for the hope that's within us, and to do so with gentleness and respect, as the scripture says. But I think we've seen a lot of people from non-Christian faith backgrounds, or maybe even from sort of nominal Christian faith backgrounds, who have interacted with Christians often for the first time in the U.S. as they've been welcomed by a team from a local church, and over time have made that decision to begin following Jesus. And that's always, a thrilling thing for us to get to see at World Relief. We don't trick anyone into following Jesus, or we don't serve them better if they do so. We don't believe in proselytism in terms of any sort of a coercive effort to convert someone. But we do believe in evangelism, rightly understood, which is being a witness to who we believe Jesus is. And again, in my experience, a lot of Muslim immigrants are more ready to ask questions about who we believe Jesus is than most American Christians are to talk about our faith. We come from a culture where it's sort of off limits to talk with people you don't know very well about your faith. But most of the parts of the world, that's not the case. People have lots of questions, and it's a great opportunity to point people to who Jesus really is.
We've had Tom Doyle on, and he's talked about that very thing, that you go in the Muslim world, and questions that you probably would say probably not appropriate to ask in Europe or in the United States are asked all the time. Well, what do you believe? Why do you believe that? Why do you, and so almost instantaneously you're in the opportunity to share your faith. And again, I don't want to say that we only help Christians because we're welcoming to help anyone that indeed has a need. And speaking about help, we have some immigrants that come here and they already connect up with a job skill. They maybe were brought here under some kind of visa, or they were hired by a tech company. They don't need a lot of help. But let me talk about on your website, worldrelief.org, you have a whole section here on help refugees rebuild their lives. If you're a refugee and maybe you left the Nineveh plain in Iraq with just the clothes on your back, and you've been in a refugee camp and you now show up here in the United States, you have a need for a lot. So let's help churches think about what it takes to help a refugee that lands in our country right now.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up. For World Relief, that's really one of our central ministries for decades now, since the 1970s, has been empowering local churches to welcome refugees. And so we work with the U.S. State Department. They do the vetting abroad. They determine who is indeed a refugee. It's only a tiny percentage of the world's refugees who get selected for resettlement in the United States, about 0.1% this year. But that's 20,000 people who this year we expect to come to the U.S., and World Relief is usually responsible for about 10% of those families. And our goal is for each family that arrives to be met at the airport by a local church. So we work in about 25 cities around the U.S. to make that happen. And, again, we do a lot of the technical stuff, but the church is there for that longer-term relationship. And it's such a core part of integration into a new community to have friends who speak the native language, who understand how the culture works. So, as you said, at worldrelief.org, you can find out both if we're in the community where you're living or how to volunteer. There's also lots of people who've come together, especially next week or a week and a half from now is World Refugee Day globally on June 20th. So we've had a lot of people step up and say, we want to help be a part of standing with refugees, advocating for refugees. So there's lots of information on how to do that on our website as well.
Right, just imagine, again, we've got World Refugee Day, and of course you can go to World Relief, .org, and the World Refugee Day is there, and there's a place where you can log in, be part of the campaign. There are all sorts of needs. I mean, everything from meeting them at the airport, providing vital services, building relationships. We're talking about people that sometimes have nothing when they basically arrive in this country. And you can imagine if everything was taken away from you, let's say you're a modern day Job. You've got your wife. That's about all you've got left. And in some respects, that's something very similar to what some of these refugees have. The church has got to step up and provide a lot more than it's normally used to providing for. Most churches assume that when you show up at church, you are clothed, you're fed, you've been well trained, you already have a source of income, you can tithe, all those kinds of things. We're talking about individuals that represent a different level of need than what most churches are geared up to actually address, don't you think?
Well, I think most churches can handle it, but it does require some training and support. And again, that's why we're there at World Relief. But it is, many of these people, you can often recognize a refugee in an airport just arrived in the U.S. because they almost always have one small bag with them. That's their cumulative possessions that they've been able to bring with them. And so that's what they're starting with. And our goal is for them to start not just with that, but with a warm welcome from some volunteers from a local church, to have an apartment to go to that's been set up and furnished, to have that friendship to walk alongside them for the first several months. And again, we've seen this over years. Refugees do remarkably well. In fact, there's been all sorts of studies on the economics of refugees. And 20 years after arrival, their income levels are often actually higher than the average native-born citizen. They're paying more in taxes than the combined cost of what they've ever received in sort of assistance from the government. But it takes that warm welcome, and the church can be central to that. And the church has been that, again, for decades, but I think it's as important as ever that the church step into that role of being a part of welcoming people who've usually lost everything and are restarting their lives here in the United States.
Well, again, just some incredible challenges just a few miles from where we're broadcasting at the moment. I'm well aware of a whole refugee community, especially at a time when we have very low unemployment, just trying to figure out how some of these individuals with not necessarily some of the technical skills that we could plug into jobs, it's a big challenge. So, again, I want churches to begin to think about what they would want to do. And if they want to contact you at World Relief, you're quite willing to come and do some training, aren't you?
Yeah, especially if it happens to be, within a radius of where we've got a local office. But that's, we're not everywhere in the country, but we're in a lot of locations. So you can find that at worldrelief.org and just click through the links in terms of refugees, and you can see where we're located.
Let's take a break. When we come back, let's open up the phones. Open line in the last half hour. I want to get into a couple of proposals that have been put forward on what to do on immigration, but love to get your comments as well. And appreciate Matthew stepping in while Jenny Yang is getting ready for motherhood. And if you would like to join the conversation today, that's 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Also have a link to the website there, which again is worldrelief.org. You can find some great resources there, and so I hope that you'll take the time to find out about World Relief and also recognize that we're getting close to this World Relief Day, and that is an opportunity for you to participate as well. So World Refugee Day is something that we'll be talking about next week as well. And again, if you'd like to know more about World Relief or World Refugee Day, join us and visit the website pointofview.net. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
The young man burst into tears. He was in obvious distress, but thankfully, Don Blight had the exact answers he needed. God took a chance encounter in a restaurant bathroom of all places and turned it into a divine appointment that forever impacted a young couple and saved the life of their unborn child. Don was able to help because he was prepared. And where does Don Blythe get some of the information and resources he needs to be ready for the next opportunity? He listens to Point of View. He listens because others like you took action. This is your opportunity to help equip people to be ready. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. You can be part of some amazing transformations, and it all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking into pointofview.net. One day, you are going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Spend a half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Have information about the book, Welcoming the Stranger. And again, a new version coming out next month, published by University Press. Should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if you wanted to pre-order it, you could do that as well. And we are privileged to have with us a little bit longer Matthew Sorens, who has stepped in while Jenny Yang is in labor, and we'll maybe chat with her in the future. Also posted this particular article that appeared in the stream. Samuel Rodriguez, who's been on the program with us, president of the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference, and James Robison, who's an evangelist with Life Outreach, have, I think, for about 4 years trying to put together something, because I know a lot of you are saying, how do Christians relate to this whole issue of immigration, and I've tried to do something that tries to reconcile the rule of law with compassion and pragmatism, and they got a number of points about securing the borders, recognizing, as we just pointed out, that a number of people aren't crossing a particular border, but actually overstaying their visas, establishing a non-amnesty path towards legal status and or citizenship for those who qualify, and this would be kind of like a guest worker program. Employers would have to accept their responsibility, and that is to use E-Verify. So the first one has to do with government, the second one, the third probably with employers, the fourth one to assimilate immigrants and guest workers and include training in civics and English. I think that's a great opportunity for the church, but also for other community organizations. And number fifth, to reform programs that discourage work, because as they quote, Milton Friedman once said, you cannot simultaneously have free immigration and a welfare state. So this would be also a way to help immigrants find gainful employment, which again can be something that individuals or the church can do. So there is, Matthew, a lot for everyone to do. It isn't just government. It isn't just individuals. It isn't just the church. It isn't local community groups. I think this is such a big issue and such a significant one when especially we come to World Refugee Day to recognize how there's a part for everybody to play in this whole particular issue.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to frame it. I think when we get to the policy questions, and again, for us at World Relief, that's not really where we start. We start with this as a church ministry opportunity. But the more you interact with immigrant families, the more that you realize how policies really do impact them. And, it also impacts our society as a whole, impacts how we view the rule of law, which is really important. So we've, for a long time at World Relief, advocated something fairly similar to what you just described. And Reverend Rodriguez has been part of something along with World Relief and this convention and various other evangelical groups called the Evangelical Immigration Table, where back in 2012 or so, we put forward a fairly basic statement of principles. These are basic principles consistent with Scripture that we think should guide Congress as they consider reforms to our nation's immigration laws. And the way I sort of boil that down is it ought to be harder to immigrate illegally. It ought to be harder to work illegally or to overstay a visa. But it also ought to be easier when we have needs in our economy and when we have families who are waiting sometimes literally decades to be reunited through legal processes. It ought to be easier to immigrate legally. And then we need to find some sort of way for those who are already here unlawfully, who in most cases have been here for a decade or more, who in many cases have U.S. citizens. We don't want to do an amnesty that says you broke the law, it's fine, it's forgiven and forgotten, here's your citizenship. But it's also not practical or particularly humane to say we're going to round up 11 million people and deport them all. So we've said there ought to be some way that people could come forward, pay a fine, acknowledging that they'd either overstayed that visa or entered the country unlawfully, and then have a way to earn permanent legal status over the course of time if they're willing to meet certain qualifications and show that they want to be a contributing member of a community, which in my experience, the vast majority of them do. And it's just not been possible under our current laws the way that they're set up.
Well, and again, I've said some of those same things. We sometimes make it too easy to get here illegally, not to minimizing the walking over deserts and all sorts of other things and the use of coyotes and all the rest. But nevertheless, we sometimes make it too easy to get here illegally and too difficult to get here legally. And if you've ever listened to some of the programs, as our listeners have, we'll sometimes have people calling in and telling stories about how they've had to jump through so many different hoops and go such a long period of time before they actually were able to be here legally or to eventually gain citizenship and all of the rest. So that's an issue. And one of those things, which I just mentioned in passing, assimilate immigrants. One of the things that I think the church and we as a community need to do is figure out ways to kind of get people involved. If you've come from a country where there's been a dictator or even a country where socialism is it, or where there is much regard for life, we want people to ultimately, if we can, become Christians, have a pro-life perspective, value participatory republic that we are in, those don't happen overnight, and it seems to me that whether it's the process of naturalization through citizenship or just the teaching that can take place in the local community, that's another real key need that we have right now in the communities, don't you think?
Yeah, and again, that's why I think the church has such an important role to play in helping immigrants integrate in, to really become Americans. And that doesn't mean, they have to leave their food at the border or, they have to only speak English, but we do want people to learn English, and if they can speak another language or 2 or 3 other languages, that's wonderful. It's just, that's an asset for sure. But helping people to fit into the community, to embrace, and again, most of them, what's drawing them to the United States are those values of our Constitution that we have. It's the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. In fact, one thing that I think is interesting is if you look at immigrants in the United States, many of them, probably even at the point they're coming in, have some values that we could learn from as Americans. They're more likely to go to church than the average American. They are, if you look at Hispanic immigrants in particular, significantly more likely to have pro-life views than the average U.S. citizen. And in fact, those who are immigrants, even more so than native-born Hispanics in the United States. Or if you look at criminal issues, if you look at first-generation immigrants, crime rates are actually significantly lower than among native-born U.S. citizens. And that's not necessarily because people are morally superior, but if you're an immigrant to the country, even with legal status, and you commit certain fairly minor crimes, it could be a deportable offense. So there's a strong disincentive to get in any sort of trouble. And if you are here unlawfully, you don't even necessarily have to have been guilty of the criminal offense. If it puts you in touch with law enforcement, it could end up in a deportation proceeding. So people have a strong disincentive towards any sort of criminal behavior. In fact, I live in a neighborhood with a lot of immigrants, and many of whom I presume don't have legal status. People drive so slow around here because they don't want to go 1 mile an hour over the speed limit, whereas a lot of Americans presume you can go a little bit more than that. And sometimes I'm stuck behind a car, and then that'll occur to me that that's part of why people are so careful about driving in my community.
Well, that's a good point, because they're in the shadows. What would you say to church members that begin to recognize that the people they're working with are there illegally? They wonder, do I have a duty to call the authorities? Of course, we have right now, many of our listeners live either in sanctuary cities or, of course, my listeners in California, they live in what essentially is a sanctuary state. So that's a real question that Christians have had to deal with in terms of the rule of law as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think and one thing that's important to clarify is there's not any federal or state law that requires someone to report someone they suspect of not having legal status. So, Christians, I think, appropriately wrestle with, Romans chapter 13 tells us to be subject to the governing authorities, that these people may not be here lawfully, which I would add is not always an easy thing to determine. I mean, as a legal counselor, it would sometimes take me a half-hour consultation to figure out if someone had legal status or not. Some of the cases are quite complex. But I think it's important to know, you can interact with people, you can befriend people, and you're not under any legal obligation to report that. The question around sanctuary municipalities, whether cities or towns or potentially states, I also think is important. And I think is very confusing because that term doesn't have a legal definition. So people use the term and mean sort of different things by it. What most cities that have that sort of policy mean is that it relates to how local law enforcement, police departments, will interact with the federal immigration law enforcement. And most of them have policies that say, we're going to ask immigrants about their legal status when they're convicted of a crime, not when they're suspected of a crime, not when they're a witness to a crime, not when they're a victim to a crime. And the rationale there is they've found, especially in communities with a lot of immigrants, that if immigrants are afraid of the police, which again, many of them are kind of instinctively because of police departments in the countries they came from that were quite different than what the police are in the U.S., then they are actually a target for crime, and they are victims of crime that don't call the police, no matter what happens to them. So a lot of local law enforcement has said, we want to control this at the local level. We'll cooperate with the federal law enforcement when someone's convicted of a serious crime, but we don't have the resources nor the desire to have at every interaction with an immigrant have to ask that question because it's a wet blanket on people reporting crimes in some ways.
Yes. Well, again, the book is entitled Welcoming the Stranger. It's got a new edition coming out next month. It is Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. If you'd like to know a little bit more about World Relief, we have that link. And, of course, we have World Refugee Day coming up. And, Matthew, appreciate you stepping in. We wish the very best for Jenny as she is having her baby, and we'll try to cover some of these immigration issues again next time we get together. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're going to take a break, and we'll come back. Supreme Court has ruled on a couple of issues, and, of course, we have a summit with the president and Kim Jong-un. We've got that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act requires a state to provide a compelling justification before it may substantially burden the free exercise of religion. But just what is a substantial burden? In 1963, the Supreme Court said that putting someone to the choice of following the precepts of her religion and forfeiting benefits on the one hand, and abandoning one of the precepts of her religion in order to accept work on the other hand, is a substantial burden. And the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit explained in 1988 that for a city to force a house of worship to move outside city limits and forbid ministry-owned property to be used for religious services substantially burdens religious liberty. The 11th Circuit in 2004 explained that a substantial burden is akin to significant pressure which directly coerces the religious adherent to conform his or her behavior accordingly, and can result from pressure that tends to force adherents to forego religious precepts or from pressure that mandates religious conduct. In 2007, the First Circuit defined substantial burden as one that puts substantial pressure on an adherent to modify his behavior and to violate his beliefs. Our country's long-standing dedication to freedom carefully protects the right of citizens to freely exercise their religion, free from a government-imposed substantial burden. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Learn more and request a free In God We Trust window cling at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org and get your free In God We Trust window cling.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Before this hour is off, I want to just spend just a minute or two at least talking about what is about ready to take place. On Tuesday, the president will be meeting with Kim Jong-un, but you've got to recognize the difference in time zones. It's really going to take place in about 6 hours. At about 9 o'clock Eastern time is 9 a.m. Singapore time. So we are just actually less than 6 hours away from the time in which you have the president of the United States, Donald Trump, and the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, getting together in one of these islands off the southern coast of Singapore. And we recognize that Kim Jong-un really wants to focus on rebuilding North Korea's economy. And thus he really is seeking some kind of relief from the sanctions and being able to have some kind of international development. On the other hand, you have Donald Trump and his administration that has made it very clear that his focus is on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So if indeed you want to have any kind of relief from the sanctions, Mr. President, well, then all you have to do is come up with a timeline and some technical details on dismantling weapons and your weapons-making capabilities. Now, the first thing I think we need to do is recognize that these kinds of debates and discussions have been taking place since 1985. That's when you had some of the first talks with North Korea failing to produce any kind of peace and nuclear disarmament. And if you look at that date, 1985, that's when Ronald Reagan was president of the United States. Then you go to George Herbert Walker Bush. You go to especially Bill Clinton and some of the various attempts to try to provide incentives, both carrot and stick, with North Korea. It went nowhere. Then under George W. Bush, and now, of course, more recently, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. So any thought that this is going to be a quick and easy breakthrough, I think, needs to be set aside. And I know that if indeed after a day or two there are no significant changes, there will be all sorts of people that will point fingers saying, see, Donald Trump has been ineffective. He's not an effective negotiator. He's failed as a president. You got to recognize these kinds of negotiations have been taking place since 1985. That's a long period of time. What is it, 33 years, something like that, that we could be talking about all these kinds of failures that have taken place, and we're going to have perhaps more of them before it all plays out. So we'll see where that goes. So that's one of the things I want to put on the table. We'll spend a little more time tomorrow talking about that and what that might mean. But I also thought I would spend just a moment talking about what I think is a very important Supreme Court decision today. Those of you in the state of Ohio probably have paid more attention to it than others, but today the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that Ohio did not violate federal laws by purging voters who don't vote and fail to return notices confirming their residency. Writing for the majority, Samuel Alito, right off the bat, noted that an estimated 1 in 8 voter registrations in the United States are invalid or inaccurate, and that should be reason enough to allow states to clean up their voter rolls. But you've got to know that the liberal wing, all 4 of them, I knew all 4 of them were going to vote against this. The only question is what would happen with the other 5 who were either moderates or conservatives, because you just knew that anything that had any potential of actually cleaning up the voter rolls would be something that just by definition the liberal wing in the court would reject, and that's exactly the case. Justice Breyer wrote the dissent and argued that voters, just simply because they ignore warning notices, should not to be purged from the rolls. And again, it just completely minimizes the argument. So for those of you who don't live in the state of Ohio, let's talk about what actually is the case. The state attempts over a 4-year period to contact voters if they've failed to vote in the last 3 elections. If they respond to any of the notices or they vote even once during that time, they remain registered. They're only removed if they fail to vote really over a total of a 6-year period and failed to respond to any mailing. Think about this for just a minute. The argument that's oftentimes made is, wait a minute. We have what's called the National Voter Registration Act, passed in 1993. It's called the Motor Voter Act by a lot of people, and it prohibits canceling registrations solely when a person does not vote. True, but that same law, passed in 1993, says that if they don't vote and if indeed the voter does not respond to mailings from the state, then you could remove them. And my question for Stephen Breyer, for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for Elena Kagan, and for Sonia Sotomayor, the 4 that voted against this, if missing 3 consecutive election cycles and ignoring every single one of the mailings from the state of Ohio is not sufficient to remove you from the voter rolls, what should be the standard? And I don't think I'm going to read the dissent. It's an 18-page dissent by Breyer tonight, see if I can find anything, but I don't think I'm going to see anything. And this, I think, should concern us, because now at least the state of Ohio is free to do this, and many other states said they'd like to follow suit. And just to help you understand the problem, I talk about this in my February commentary, which you can find in our Viewpoint section in Point of View. We have 248 counties in this country that actually have more names on the voter rolls than the total number of people of voting age in those counties at the time of the 2016 election. So we have lots of potential for mischief, and we have individuals that have been on those rolls for years who are individuals who are deceased or who have moved or have duplicate registrations. And we certainly know in many cases, as individuals have investigated this, of individuals who have indeed been able to vote using outdated voter registration rolls so that they can actually begin to change the voting records. Now, earlier we talked with Matthew Sorens about the fact that, of course, we were talking about immigration, but for those of you that sometimes listen to some of the other broadcasts I've done, I had Senator Don Huffines on the other day pointing out that just in Dallas County alone, and this is just in that county, they have already identified 1,500 or more individuals who are on the voter rolls who actually are registered to vote. And these are self-reported. It's where they come in for jury duty and they say, well, I'm not supposed to serve on jury duty because I'm not a citizen. And they go, well, you're voting. Well, and some of these individuals have voted since 1980. So you have a situation in which people who are not citizens who are voting in elections. You have other individuals who are on the voter rolls who either have moved or they're maybe duplicate registrations or they're deceased and other people using them to vote. There's just so much potential for mischief. Can't we clean up the voter rolls? Well, by a vote of 5-4, and it should have been 9-0, the Supreme Court ruled that Ohio is allowed to do that, and I suspect now other states will follow suit as well. Well, that's all we have for today. I would encourage you to find out a little bit more about some of the issues that we've posted here. We've got some great material here on various standards and also on some of the books that we've talked about today, the new Copernicans, as well as Welcoming the Stranger. So you can find all of it at our website, pointofview.net. As we come to the end of our fiscal year, which ends up this month, I hope you'll consider what kind of gift you might give to help us end our fiscal year in the black. So if you can help us out, click on that button that says donate. And of course, we also encourage you to share your story. We'd love to hear that and encourage you to share it with others as well. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.